Today we're going to start a watercolor project. I always thought that this was a good beginner's project. This is a kind of a seascape landscape painting that my daughter did in high school, and I always loved it. I always thought it was really moody and it was always a nice piece for beginners. So one of the things that really makes this piece work is something called complementary colors. And if you look at a color wheel, if you go on the internet and pull up a color wheel, complementary colors are on the opposite side of the color wheel from each other. So we have kind of a red-orange with a red-orange sky with a kind of bluish, kind of a slightly muted blue ocean. And those colors against each other cause a certain kind of energy. They cause a certain kind of vibration. That's kind of what complementary colors do. They generate a vibration, and they kind of fight each other when they're intense. So that's one of the uses of complementary colors, is to place them against each other and cause that kind of vibration, that kind of energy. So we're going to start with thinking about always having a game plan. By the way, before we get too far into it, every time we do a piece of artwork here, we're going to tape down our paper here. Again, the reason for this is so we don't have the paper curl up on us when it gets wet. The paper will curl if it's not taped down. Sometimes it curls a little bit anyway, but when it's taped down, it's still manageable. So that's the first thing we always want to do. And we want to do that neatly so we create a really nice crisp border around our artwork. When we pull the tape off, we have this really nice frame around the piece. So sometimes it's not a bad idea to take your finger and run your finger along the tape. You don't want to go nuts pushing it too hard. Just want to make sure it's secure and you have a nice clean crisp edge from your tape. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start mixing our colors here. So I'm going to start, remember, with watercolor we always want to go light to dark. That's the way we control a transparent medium. So I'm using medium yellow here. I'm going to throw a little white out there as well. This is Chinese white. Put a little bit of that out there as well. So we can do a couple things here. The way to really just kind of take it safely here is to kind of mix up this almost kind of a yellow-orange cast first. And we could do like a wash over the entire thing with a yellow-orange cast, or wash, or glaze, as a lot of people call them. All right, so the reason for this is like we can have a tinted layer of this orange, red-orange glaze, and then we can kind of come back over it with another wash, and that'll be underneath it and tint the color that we're putting over it. I'm going to grab a bit of a bigger brush, and I'm going to mix up a bit more of this than I have. And so I'm using medium yellow, orange, and I'm throwing some white in there because I don't want this to be out of the tube color. I want it to be a little bit more muted. That's one of the other things that's making this particular piece work so well. It's very moody. The colors are a bit muted, kind of a dusk sunset scene. So again, what I'm trying to do here is get a really nice watery mixture here that I can put over the entire thing. All right. Now, I could go straight in and paint this without doing wet into wet, but remember, wet into wet, the reason we do it is so colors will really blend together nicely. So I'm mixing up my colors, and I'm going to let that sit for a second. I'm going to take my 3/4 inch flat brush, and I'm going to take some clean water, and I'm going to go over my sky with a wet into wet process, okay? So now I have my colors all ready to go. So when I'm ready to paint, I can just throw them right in there. Now there's a couple different ways you could approach this. If you had your distant mountain range right here, a different color than your sky, you could paint around it with the water and create like a watermark that your paint would not go past. But in this case, I want my mountains to be tinted by the yellow orange. So I'm gonna paint my layer of yellow orange right over that distant mountain line, and let it tint my distant mountains as well. If you start paying a little more attention to some photographs, if you look at sunsets scenes, you'll see that a lot of times where the sun is behind mountains, distant mountains, they'll be tinted by the sunset. So it's this is a case where we're going to let that happen. If I wanted to have like a more of a bluer distant mountain range here, I wouldn't let that happen. I would try to separate them, and I would make sure I would kind of paint around my mountain range like this, and let my watermark stop that paint from bleeding past that particular spot, so I wouldn't have those colors mixed, because it would kind of cancel each other out. All right, so that's looking good. I always check my mountain, my wet into wet, by kind of making sure I tilt my head to the side and make sure I get all that extra water off, because I don't want to have a blooming effect. All right, so in this case here, what I'm going to try to do is, I'm not going to make a perfectly round sun. I'm going to freehand it, because on a hazy day like this, you see sometimes the clouds are in front of the sun, and it's not perfectly round. It can be you know, not quite round. It can be an oblong shape. When you do this, guys, don't worry too much about it. You know, I'm going to let this middle, I'm going to pull that color out in the middle. I'm just going to let this yellow orange just cover this entire layer. So I'm going to let it tint everything here. I'm going to leave a little bit, I'm just going to see how this works. I'm going to leave a little bit, I kind of like the way that's looking, so I think I'll let that white just kind of stay there. Keep that in my central spot. Now I could use a bigger brush here as well if I wanted, but I'm using a number 6, but this is working fine. And you see, it's really just taking the paint nice, because I have that paper already pre-moistened. I'm doing that wet into wet process, all right? So what I'm going to do after this is I'm going to let that sit, but I'm going to take a cleaner brush, and I'm going to pull out a little bit more of that sunny area here. I like the way that's looking. The only danger is I may end up actually killing that white spot. We'll see how it goes. I'm going to see if I can do it. I'll take a couple clean brushes here, and I'm going to make sure it's moist, and I'm going to see if I can pull some of that, a little bit more of that yellow orange out of this area where I want the sun to be. That's actually working nice. All right, so remember, guys, this is one of the couple ways that you can do this. Now the nice thing about this, because it's still wet, the paper's moist, the paint is still wet, I'm having a really easy time taking this out. All right, so this will really help give us this soft, hazy sun. What I'm doing is I'm just letting my brush pull that paint off, and then I'm wiping it off on a piece of paper towel. All right. I'm not going to overwork this though. I'm going to take, this is now a completely dry brush. I'm just going to soften the edge of this a little bit. I want this to stay soft and hazy and undefined. Again, I'm just kind of taking my brush and pulling little bits of paint off. And now that's working really nice. I really like it. All right, so that's a really good start for that first layer. Take a little bit more. All right, that's great. All right, so now I'm just going to hit it with a hairdryer real quick and dry that. Remember, a hairdryer is a really handy tool when we want to move along and we want to get things going and we don't want to wait. So now I'm just double checking my sky. It's nice and dry. Just hit it with the hairdryer. I'm going to mix up my main field of my sky color now that I'm going to overlay on top of this. So I'm going to take some orange, taking some of that medium yellow. I'm going to take a little bit of red. This is actually brilliant red that I'm using here. Now it's, again, this is not pure red. So what I'm looking at here is I'm seeing burnt sienna in there, a bit of a brown. So I'm going to steal some of that and poke a little bit of that in there. And I'm going cautiously here because I really want to get this color right. So I love the moodiness of it. So I'm going to really try to get this color the way I want it. Now I can just kind of put this over the top of this and look. That's not far off. I want to kill that red a little bit more with some of the sienna, the burnt sienna. I could throw some burnt umber in there as well. Maybe just a touch. Burnt umber is a bit of a darker brown, or a true brown. Now that's looking pretty good. I like that. I think that's going to work. I'm going to throw a little more white into it. But I want more of it, so I'm going to mix that up again with a bigger brush and get a little bit more of it. I think what I'm going to do with this one, I remember the importance here of having a game plan, guys. I'm going to start around the sun and work my way out because I want to manage this area. This is really, to me, a really critical area because this haze, you could almost get away with this sky the way it is. It kind of came out so nice. So I want to really preserve this, and I'm going to keep this area the way it is, and I'm going to kind of just let that blend out around it. It's going to be a little tricky. I'm going to have to move rather quickly, so I'm just going to take my time. And I'm thinking as I'm looking at this, I might want to just throw a little bit of water down over the top of this just to help me to blend it. But keep that nice watercolor look to this area. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to throw some water around this area. I'm almost like doing another wet into wet right over this existing color. I got to be careful not to reactivate the paint too much and then manipulate it because then it'll change what I have. So I'm going to just let this happen now. I'm looking at that sheen again. Careful not to have too much pooling going on here. That means I don't want the water to gather in little puddles on my page because that will cause a slight blooming effect if I have too much of that. All right, so that looks pretty good. Now I think I can go ahead and I'm actually going to go ahead and wet the rest of this too. That's good enough. I'm going to go in now and throw some of this color in. Right, so I'm going to let this kind of start out a little further. I'm just going to pull my paint away from the center of that sun area. Come in a little closer. Now I'm just taking a real clean brush. I'm just going to play with this edge a little bit and keep it soft. I want that haziness, that really soft, moody look to stay there. Now I got to be careful I don't cause my outer edges to dry by not getting to them quick enough. So I'm definitely going to keep my eye on that. And I'm also going to let my sky vary a little bit. I'm not going to keep it all one uniform, consistent color. I'm going to let some of this background bleed through in spots as well. So. Now I could come back and pull some of this out if I wanted to have some slight variations in the sky. Like for instance, I could pull my brush through this area and get a little bit of that background showing through, which would be kind of cool. I'm just taking a moist brush and I'm pulling a little bit of that red-orange out to create some variation in that sky. Let some of that background color show through. So I kind of like that. I'm gonna hit this with a hairdryer real quick. So now I'm gonna mix up that distant mountain range. And I'm looking at that, I'm seeing burnt sienna and some burnt umber and maybe some of that red. I'm taking a little bit of this leftover sky color. I'm getting that pretty quick. That looks fairly close to what I want. I can check it by going over my lighter area here. That looks pretty good, actually. I like that. Again, I got to be careful. I don't load the brush too much, which I just kind of did. Don't want too much paint there. So now you can see that under layer is really tinting that. And it's a nice combination. Now, when you're laying in the edge of these mountains too, you want to make sure, you know, you're able, you know, it's okay to kind of wiggle your brush around and get some variations there. So it looks like there may be some distant trees there, or just don't want them to be too perfect. So I'm going to let that little piece end there. And then I'm going to put even like a more distant mountain just for the heck of it. And remember, when things are further away, they're lighter in value. And they get a little bit less colorful. So I'm going to throw in even a lighter version of this and see how that looks if I create this more distant mountain range. Should be a little bit lighter in value than the previous one. See how we do with that. So that works pretty good. Go back to this. Now, one of the things we can do is, again, remembering that we want to really think about what we're going to do before we do it, so we have a game plan. So what I want, looking at all these dark mountains in the foreground, I want to make sure I put my my blue water down first, because it's going to be a lot easier for me to put a dark over that blue than for me to try to work around all that dark stuff and possibly, you know, re-moisten it and dirty up that blue. We want that blue to stay clean. All right, so again, because we're on the opposite side of the color wheel here, and if those complementary colors mix together, they're going to kind of cancel each other out. They're going to eliminate that kind of vibrancy that we want. So as I look at it, I think it's a pretty good combination of phthalo blue and some ultramarine blue. So I'm going to throw a couple of them out there, some burnt umber, so they're not, again, too brilliant. Because in this situation, we're looking at a sunset sky. It's not going to be as brilliant as a sunny day sky. The water would definitely not be as blue. All right, so we're going to be mindful of that. So I'm going to grab the two blues, mix them together. I'm going to throw some white in there. And I'm going to just tint it again. Again, do this in little increments, guys. When you tint your blue with burnt umber, I'm just using a little bit at a time. And now you can see I'm getting lighter and I'm getting a little bit less chromatic, a little bit less colorful, which is what I want. I don't want it to be that out of the two blue. It's just too brilliant for this situation. So that's looking pretty good. I'm liking it, and again, I want to make sure I have a decent amount of it. So now when I go back in over here, I don't have to be so super careful if I go over some of those lines of where the mountains are and those little peninsulas and stuff, because that dark value, that dark mountain value would go over this really easily and wouldn't be affected by this light blue underneath. So one thing I did that I kind of wish I didn't do, I kind of bled over the top of this. If I had my line more defined, I probably wouldn't have had that. So, but that's okay. I'm going to just lay this in. And one thing to remember too is when you're painting water, water always wants to be horizontal. So you want to make sure your strokes are staying horizontal. All right. I'm kind of liking the lighter value. So I'm just pulling a little bit more paint out while I can, while it's still wet. Okay, that looks nice. I'm going to keep going with this now. And you see this muted orange and the muted blue work great together. They're complements of each other, but yet they're both muted, so that it's really kind of a unity that's going on here that really does work nice. I'm going to pull this paint over where the mountains, those little peninsulas and mountains are. And I'm not worried about it, again, because that darker value will go over this really with no trouble whatsoever. So I'm being really conscious to keep my strokes horizontal. And if you have some striations in there, that's fine. You may ask yourself why we didn't do wet into wet here. We're not really having a situation where we're actually blending colors here. We're really just laying in these horizontal strokes, and so we don't really need to be blending so much. Now this type of painting, it really doesn't have a whole lot of detail. It's really kind of in the game plan and in the approach here. And you can see this really is working nice. I'm going to add a little bit more water over here in the front and surround this foreground peninsula here. So these guys I'm going to kind of turn into so I'm going to go hit this with a hair dryer. Okay, so now I can come back in and mix up my mountain colors. I'm going to go from left to right and kind of control this. I don't want to be bringing my hand over this and try to do this area after I paint this. So I'm going to come this way. Again, with a little bit of a game plan, it helps. This background mountain color. There's really not a whole lot of detail on this. We have a couple layers going on. I'm using burnt umber here, and you can see I just flicked some water, some paint. I just flicked some paint onto my painting, which is really annoying. But if I catch it quick, I can get it out of there without any damage. You have to really do it quickly, though. All right, so that's no harm done there. Just keep your eyes, keep aware that can happen, guys, when you're doing this. So this is kind of a gray brown. So I'm going to use burnt umber and Payne's gray. Now I'm going to do these mountains in 2 layers. I'm going to put a lighter layer down first, and then I'm going to come back with a darker layer over the top of it. It's just a way to control it a little bit more. So you can see this underlayer I have is a little bit grayer and less colorful and a little lighter in value. And I'll come back and punch it up with a little bit of a darker version of that same color. Now again, remember when you're working in smaller areas, you can't let your paint get too wet or too soupy because it'll get away from you. So you just have to always keep that test paper, keep that piece of scrap paper, and just try it out a little bit in an area and make sure that you're able to control it in a way that suits that little particular situation that you're working on. And that's working pretty good. So I'm going to use a brush with a little bit more of a point on it. This is a different Blick brush. This is their Master Synthetic series. This is not in our kit, but you can use a number 2 brush to do the ridge line here of this top of this mountain. I'm going to throw this mountain, edge of the mountain in with a little bit more of a variation in the edge of it to make it almost look like it has trees on it. So you can see, again, I'm lighter in value than my reference material, but I have a game plan here. I'm coming back in with a darker value over the top of this. Again, this is just my way of controlling it. We want to be able to control this the best we can, all right? So I'm coming over to this area here, and I'm going to pull all this paint together now. And then I'm going to play with that top edge and give it a little bit more of an indication that we might have some trees up there. So I'm just going to take my brush and let it poke up and down. Nothing too specific. I'm just trying to give it a little bit of variation here that these could possibly be distant trees, right? Now, I didn't follow my reference material to the T. That's sometimes kind of the fun of this a project like this. You can change it a little bit, and it's not. No one's ever going to know. I mean, this doesn't. No one's checking to see if you are super accurate or not. It really doesn't matter. This is almost like a made-up landscape anyway. So again, the same thing. I'm going to take. I have a little bit more of a distant peninsula sticking out over here that's in the water. The thing I have to be careful of with this one is that I don't make that too wet and it would just run all over the place. So that worked pretty good. I just have to be careful. Remember, as these things get further away, the trees would then be smaller as well if there were trees on it. So I'm just going to make them a little closer together. Okay, now as I come up and I finish this mountain range here, I'm going to be aware that I have these kind of sweeping separations here between them. This is not colored in all solid. There's variations going on in this mountain range here. So I want to make sure that I pay attention to that and I bring that in. So that'll be reflected in the way I paint this. I want to take advantage of that with my strokes and try to depict a little bit of that separation going on between these. So you can see from here to the next mountain ridge, there's a little bit of a difference in value. That'll also be punctuated by our next layer as we bring our next layer in. But I'm going to take my strokes and I'm going to bring them that same and mimic what's going on there. Again, I'm just using burnt umber, Payne's gray, and a little bit of white. I get that first layer. It's kind of a brown gray. Now we could justify these little smaller islands or as boulders or whatever we really want them to be. They can either be boulders or small little islands. I kind of like the idea of having them be boulders. So I could, play with this area a little bit and change it if I want to, make it look more like boulders that are sitting in the water there. I have to go exactly to the reference material. I grabbed a bigger brush. I grabbed my number 10 brush here because I'm just going. The smaller brush with the finer tip on it won't lay in a broad area as nicely as a bigger brush. So you use the right tool for the right job. So you can see I'm having a way easier time laying in the rest of this with this bigger brush. Okay, so I'm going to hit that with a hairdryer. And okay, so I'm going to go put out a little bit more my Payne's Gray and my burnt umber to mix the darker version of that mountain color. I'm going to follow the same path I took before, where I'm going to start with this area first. Again, I can check how my value is. This again is Payne's Gray and burnt umber. I mean, I could even throw some blue in there if I wanted to, change it up a little bit. And I can just go over my previous little test spots and see what they look like. And that's pretty good. I might want to go even a little darker. Let's see. All right, so I'm not going to make it too watery because I want it to be able to control it over here. So I'm going to start with these areas here. Lay that dark in. Now in a situation like this, it usually will be nicer if it's darker at the top and then kind of just fades a little bit towards the bottom. You can see how nice it is to have that previous layer there now. It just happens very easily. I'm just going to kind of clean my brush off and then just let this fade a little bit at the bottom. A little bit of that value change there, which will be nice. I definitely want some variation here in my values. I don't want it to be all solid. So I'm going to keep it a little lighter at the bottom. So you can see what I'm doing here at the top of each ridge. The top I'm having a darker value. As I, like here, I'm darker here, and I get it lighter as I come down. Darker here, a little lighter there. It just gives us the illusion of some kind of depth going on here, and we have separation between these little these mountains and the valleys between each of these. Now you could do this too and not have trees on the mountains too. They could just kind of be these kind of rough angular mountains if you wanted to as well. There's no right or wrong here. This is one of the rare cases where I'm not using photographic reference. I'm using my daughter's painting, and you know, I'll have to ask her if she actually used a photograph for this. So again, you could see the benefit of having the variation in values here. It's darker at the top, and as I get to the valley of each little section of mountains, I lighten up the value a little bit. This allows me to have the next mountain range show up a little better. All right, so it's one of the reasons we're doing that. Again, I keep dipping into my blue just to have a little bit of variation in color. It's almost not noticeable, but in a couple spots I'll make it a little stronger. And again, it's always nice to have a color change when things are overall the same color and same values. Having a color change can really add interest to a piece. So I'm going to keep going with this. Again, the mixture is Payne's Gray, Burnt Umber, and I'm throwing some blue in there as well. I'll strengthen up some of the blue here in one of the spots to see how that looks. Let's take this ridge here and just make it a little bluer. I could also throw like little pops of this color in here and there too for interest. It doesn't have to be just in one particular spot. So. All right, so as I'm finishing up here, I'm adding a little bit of accenting with some darker values here. Um, just punching up a couple of spots like where the top of the ridge lines are. Just adding a little bit more contrast with that dark. It's kind of a combination of burnt umber, phthalo blue, and Payne's gray. A little less umber than Payne's gray and blue. But you can see what it's doing for it. It's just giving it a little bit more punch. I just added some kind of lines in the rocks and nothing all that specific. I just kind of did it. All right, so the last thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to throw in some foreground trees just to give it a little more interest. I feel like it was a little boring over here, so I'm just taking Payne's gray, phthalo blue, and some viridian green. It almost appears to be black, but it's not quite black. And I'm just drawing in these trees. What I did is I started with a line, like a tree trunk line, and I'm making that very thin as well. So, and the best thing to do is really just kind of look at a picture of a tree and try to mimic what's going on there. Now, I'm not going to put a lot of detail into this, but I am going to try to make it look somewhat believable here. It's almost given the appearance of a silhouette here. Again, that's because of the lighting situation. We don't have a lot of light on this tree, so it's almost going to be a silhouette. So you guys can use the tree I painted here as your reference. I don't want the paint to be too soupy and run away on me, so I'm making it a little bit more of a dry mix here. Let's just kind of go over how I'm going to do this again. I'm going to just draw a thin line, and then I'm going to just kind of draw this tree in without too much toil. I certainly don't want to do something, something like this where I'm going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and have it look completely fake. So I want to make it look somewhat believable here. Remember, our darkest values will always be in the foreground. Shadows are darker in the foreground. Things get lighter in value as they get further away from us. So that's why I'm making this area here with the trees that I just made even darker in value than those darks we had in the mountains. And it just gives us the illusion of depth. And you can see I don't really have to do a whole lot to these. Again, it's because of the lighting situation that we're in. We don't really have a lot of detail going on here. There's no ambient light on the front of these trees from the view that we're taking. And so that means we can really get away with almost like a silhouette.